Hello and welcome. We have Mike and Dan. We're going to host a debate, the motion of which is going to be this House believes in open borders. Taking the affirmative position, we have Mike Huemer, probably one of my favorite philosophers. Dan is also one of my favorite philosophers at the University of Colorado Boulder. And then we have Dan Demetriou. He is a professor at the University of Minnesota at Morris, I believe. Okay, perfect. They are each going to have 10-minute opening statements. I'm going to give it an indication if anybody goes over. But yes, so without further ado, Mike, if you want to provide an opening, you can go ahead and do so.
Oh, okay, thanks. Good to be here and good to see you all. So I'm just going to kind of like repeat what I've said, multiple times before on the subject of immigration. Okay, so my central argument is something like this. First, people have a prima facie right against harmful coercion. That is, it's wrong to harmfully coerce other people without having a good reason for doing so. And the second main premise is immigration restrictions are harmful and coercive. And so conclusion is that immigration restrictions are at least prima facie wrong. And then we have to look at the reasons that people offer in favor of these restrictions. And I think that they're just not good enough to overcome the usual right against harmful coercion. Okay, so, some more detail on that. Why do I think people have a right against harmful coercion? Well, this just explains our ethical intuitions about various cases. And I don't think that this is very controversial. So now I did say harmful coercion intentionally. So not all coercion is wrong. Maybe, you might have an issue about, say, paternalistic coercion. I'm not saying anything about that. I'm only talking about coercion that's actually harmful to the person. And then, not all ways of harming people are wrong. So, if you compete with somebody in business and you cause their business to fail because you're just better at business, that's not wrong, right? But it is prima facie wrong if you harm them by using force against them. Okay. And then, why do I say immigration restrictions are harmful and coercive? Well, it's not voluntary. So the government hires armed guards to try to stop people from coming in without the government's permission. And if they find people in the country without the government's permission, then, they send some of these armed guards to forcibly take them captive and forcibly move them across the border. So that is coercive. Is it harmful? Well, consider if somebody were to force you to live in a third world country for the rest of your life, would you think that that harmed you? Well, I think it would be a very large harm. And okay, so that's the harm that potential immigrants are suffering when they're not able to migrate to their desired destination country. So they're suffering the same harm that you would suffer if somebody forced you to live in that country for the rest of your life. All right. Okay. Now, an objection might be, you might think, oh, it's not really harming them. It's merely failing to benefit them, refusing to give them a benefit, or stopping, failing to prevent a harm, or something like that. I want to say no. It is really harming them. All right. So here's my favorite example, the starving Marvin example. That so Marvin is hungry and he wants to get some food. And fortunately, there's a marketplace where he could get some food. And there are people there who would be happy to give him some food or happy to trade with him for food. And so, everything would work out if nobody interfered. But unfortunately, there's this asshole Sam who decides to, bar the road with his M16 and stop Marvin from getting to the marketplace. And so as a result, Marvin is unable to get there and he has to go home hungry, and then he starves. All right. So did Sam harm Marvin, or did he merely fail to benefit him? No, obviously he actively harmed Marvin. He didn't just fail to benefit him or refuse to give him a benefit. All right. And what this example shows is that if there's a harm that somebody is going to suffer, but also they're going to do something to prevent that harm, if you actively stop them from preventing the harm, that counts as harming them. It's not merely failing to benefit them. All right. So the U.S. government is, like Sam in this example, Uncle Sam, so to speak. And the immigrants are like Marvin. So, okay. And then, what are the reasons that are usually given? So, okay, so there's a prima facie right. I don't believe in any absolute rights. So I think even if you're violating a right, it could be justified if there are sufficiently strong countervailing considerations. So, what are the reasons that are usually offered for restricting immigration? The most popular thing that people have said traditionally is that immigrants steal American jobs, right? That they're, and allegedly they're harming the economy or something. Okay, so you can consider this sort of example. Okay, so Marvin is going to go to the marketplace, and Sam has some nephews and nieces who also like to trade in the marketplace. And Sam is afraid that if Marvin gets there and trades freely with the other people in the marketplace, he will bid up the price of food, and then Sam's own nephews and nieces will be slightly disadvantaged because of that. All right, so that's why he had to stop Marvin from getting there. All right, this seems like obviously unacceptable. This is not a good enough reason, right? Okay, and I think that's comparable to saying that we have to stop migrants from getting here to just compete fairly and freely in the marketplace, stop them from competing freely in the marketplace, and thereby slightly disadvantaging low-income American workers, right? Okay, another thing that's sometimes said is, well, they create fiscal burdens, so they'll use government services, which will cost the government money. Okay, so, and I think this is comparable to Sam saying, well, I have this charity program whereby I give free money to poor people in the marketplace. And so if Sam got to the marketplace, I would give him free money because I've already decided to give free money to all the poor people there. And I don't want to give him free money, so I have to stop him from getting there and trading with the other people who want to trade with him. This is obviously an unacceptable rationale. Sam can decide that he doesn't want to give the free money. He can change his policy, but he can't violate what would otherwise be somebody's rights in order to prevent himself from voluntarily giving that person money, right? Okay, and libertarians sometimes point out that the tax money that will be used to provide government services is stolen money, right? But which is true, but that doesn't give Sam the right to violate other rights in order to prevent himself from violating the rights of the people who are already there in the marketplace, right? In general, pro-immigration people say there's a variety of problems that are supposed to occur with immigration, and the pro-immigration people usually say, well, you should adopt the least coercive means of addressing those problems. So, if you're still worried about the fiscal impacts of immigration, we'll just make the least coercive, least harmful adjustment to policy to prevent those problems. Like we could change our policy so that immigrants aren't, they're not eligible to get government assistance or something like that, right? Or that they get lower levels of government programs, or they could even get higher taxes or whatever. But the more coercive option of completely excluding from the country is not justified, right? Okay, and then another sort of thing that people worry about is, well, maybe some of the immigrants will be terrorists or criminals, and the right response to that is, well, we should just try to stop the terrorists and the criminals from coming in. You don't have to stop everyone from coming in, right? So try to figure out who are the people who are at highest risk. For doing the bad things we don't want to happen. Just try to have a targeted policy that excludes them. Right now, our policy makes it difficult for virtually anyone, right? British old ladies would have a hard time immigrating to the United States, and just we don't have to do that. We don't have to impose this restriction on everyone. All right, so anyway, I think that covers all of my major points. So yeah, that's enough.
Perfect. So with that, yeah, thanks. You had like a minute left anyway. Yeah, with that, so Dan, if you want to go ahead and just share your screen, because I know that you had a PowerPoint that you wanted to use.
Okay, well, thanks, Mike, for debating me, and thanks, Nathan, for setting this up, and Stephen for moderating. I'm going to have two parts, one against what I call Lobot libertarian open borders theory generally, and then I'll talk about Mike in particular. Against libertarian open borders generally, I think they're confused between two different claims. One I call open access, which is that people have a strong moral right to freely cross international borders, just like they do international borders, and less radical view, which says no, just that non-citizens have a strong prima facie right to immigrate wherever they please. And they're often, I don't accuse Mike of this too pointedly, but some are very confused about whether or not they are for open access. Okay, so they need to get clear on that. If you've read the paper that was sent out to people, you see some examples of them being unclear on this issue. They usually, another objection is that Lobot concessions seem to appeal to exceptions like keeping out criminals, keeping out terrorists, people with contagious diseases, etc., that require very strict border control. So it's sort of a misnomer to call it open borders. In fact, they would require very, very strict closed borders. I mean, very strict patrolled borders. Controlled borders is probably the name that we want. Much more strict, actually, than even just a very restrictionist society would have to have in order to sort of vet these people. And I don't really see any way for them to do the vetting, by the way. And so, they need actually super robust open border, closed borders, actually, I mean, controlled borders. Another objection is that forsaking open access is in tension with some of their basic arguments. They often give an argument that I call sort of the migrant-citizen symmetry argument, that if you can't do it to a citizen, you shouldn't do it to a migrant because it's a sort of right, not sort of a legal right, or a moral right that should only extend to compatriots, but a right that is a human right that extends to anybody, and a sort of natural right to freedom of movement. So, this raises all these puzzles for me. Like, if you can't keep a former felon from moving from Arizona to New Mexico, why can you keep one from moving from Mexico to New Mexico? If you can't exile a sick American, why can you keep a sick non-American out of America if he has Ebola or whatever? If you can't limit the movement of Americans you suspect of terrorism, why can you limit the movement of a non-American you suspect of terrorism from coming in? If you can't limit the intrastate movement of armed Andy, why can you limit the interstate movement of armed Abdul into America or all his buddies? So here I have a picture of the No Fucking Around Coalition, which is a black militia that appeared during the BLM riots. I'm not saying they're rioters, but they appeared. Okay, totally legal in America for them to march like this. I'm not against them marching like this, but I would not want a bunch of non-Americans marching like this. So if they have, but if the right that the No Fucking Around coalition have to march with guns in America, then why, if there's migrant-citizen symmetry, can't migrants do the same? Against Huemer, I want to just point out, okay, I'm going to assert, let me say, I'm just asserting that Huemer is not really an open borders advocate. He seems to be more of an open residence advocate. All right, that's fine. But kind of only if leftists aren't in charge of things, or if leftists don't have a lot of power. And leftists always seem to have a lot of power. And so I wish that Huemer and other libertarian open borders theorists would say, well, only when we reach this stage where leftists aren't in charge, or leftists aren't going to be like taking over all the institutions dealing with migration, then we're for open borders. No, they seem to be advocating for open borders. Their rhetoric and their memes are sort of appealed to by leftists advocating for open borders, even though the leftists have no intention of doing the sort of stuff that Lobots want them to do. So, for instance, to some degree, Huemer's libertarian open borders theory is not more persuasive than his radical libertarianism, which may be true. Okay, but it needs to be noted for fans of open borders that it's no more obvious than his kind of extreme libertarian views are. So Sam is a random mafioso in the Sam Marvin case, but only an anarchist is going to think that a government cannot be authorized to limit migration. None but an extreme libertarian and anarchist thinks that one national wishing to trade with Marvin means that the government cannot stop this transaction. The marketplace analogy, Huemer likes to get the Marvin case off the ground. He doesn't want to extend to just, well, okay, let countries be marketplaces, but marketplaces discriminate all the time. Marketplaces keep people out. Marketplaces require controlled entry, etc. Why not do the same thing? He doesn't like that because, there's a sort of sovereignty relationship that a marketplace owner has vis-a-vis the entry of the marketplace that a government doesn't have towards the land. So you can't have that. Again, this is a very libertarian type way of framing it. I don't think you have to own America to exclude people from it. The people can exclude migrants from their territory. So I think the question then becomes, well, is it just or prudent to exclude migrants? And I think it is, so just take terrorism and crime. Huemer has no story to tell. And in fact, there is no story to tell about how we can, quote unquote, vet migrants. So I have a funny little alternative to the Marvin case called Tamerlan the Terrorist. It just basically involves Mike, who got fired for faking thought experiments. And now he's a border control bureaucrat, and he's just sort of, eyeballing these migrants who have thrown their documents out anyway. He has no clue who these people are, right? No one does. And just trying to see if they look like a square dude. And, they probably aren't. What are you going to do about NGOs that are basically funding people to come? Mass migration absolutely does. We see it in every country where it's happening. Overburden the social services. Again, now what Lobot is going to say to this is just keep migrants from using the social services. Let's build a wall around the welfare state. Okay. But it's not a keyhole solution. This isn't like a minor tweak to imagine leftists disappearing from power, especially when they seem to gain power whenever a large unhappy underclass appears, and under open borders, it certainly would. You clearly get more religious and ethnic conflict. We see that happening in every Western country that is seeing mass migration, and not just Western country, every country that has seen mass migration. Okay, so that's not good for the that's not good for the receiving country or the natives. It does result in permanent cultural change, not always for the better, I would say always inevitably actually for the worse, which results in less cultural diversity. So if you're a fan of cultural diversity, you want to be rather restrictionist. And now this is an argument that isn't often given. I know most of my restrictionist friends, some, are maybe sort of like IQ nationalists, or just, bring in elites, or bring in the smartest people to the country and so forth, bring in people who aren't criminal, bring in people who are smart, industrious, and so forth. But I see this also as a negative, okay, and an injustice to our own people. I think the land, the culture, and the institutions of a nation ought to be preserved for the children of the nation, and not handed over to foreigners. Okay, so that would tell against mass migration, even of the type of people that Huemer, in the best of circumstances, want to come. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
All right, perfect. So that concludes that portion. With that, Mike, if you want to go ahead and respond, you can. You have 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay. So anyway, I'm not sure if I have enough time to address everything Dan mentioned, but I'll just see how far I go. First, Dan suggested that we would need more extensive controls at the border than even restrictionists would propose, and I want to say, well, I don't think that So in order to only let in the safe migrants and exclude the criminals and the terrorists, I don't think that we would need anything more extensive than the status quo. So, like, because we already have this, we already have a system where the government decides whether to let people in, and they have them make these applications and they review all these things. So it doesn't seem like it's infeasible. It's just that we're very restrictive about who gets in. We could be more liberal. Um, Dan mentioned that some libertarians draw analogies between foreigners and citizens, and so then there's a question about like why you could restrict suspected terrorists from coming into the country when you couldn't restrict a suspected terrorist in one state from moving to another state, which I guess is the case. But I mean, well, there's probably a different level of threat from foreigners than there is from domestic people. So that is the overall threat level is different. So if we had different policies where, we would just let people into the country regardless of whether they were suspected terrorists, then that would cause a lot more harm to our society, that policy, than the policy of allowing criminal suspects to move from one state to another. So there's probably a utilitarian explanation for these different rules. Okay, so Dan suggested that, well, I guess he described my view as being that we should have open borders provided that leftists are not in charge. I don't want leftists to be in charge, but also I think even if, so about half of the government, I think, or about half of the leaders are Democrats, about half of them are Republicans. And so I'm not saying that we should only allow more immigration if we get rid of the Democrats, which is not likely to happen, right? So like part of my analogy was, well, Sam has decided that he is going to steal money from people in the marketplace and give it to the poor people in the marketplace. He's decided to do that, and he refuses to change that policy. Does that now give him the right to stop Marvin from coming in and voluntarily trading with the people in the marketplace? Like, no, he doesn't have the right to do that just because he's also decided to violate somebody else's rights if he doesn't do that, right? All right, let's see. Marketplace. So Dan made the point that marketplaces can discriminate, or at least in, I guess, in libertarian philosophy, a marketplace can decide to exclude you just because they don't like your face. Like they don't need to have special justification. They could just not want to trade with you. Now, my view is, well, any individual can decide not to trade with any other individual. So you can decide that you don't want to trade with immigrants if you want. And, you might be a jerk, but, you're within your rights. Okay, but, does that mean that, quote, the country can discriminate? Well, the country isn't an agent, so that doesn't really make sense. What could happen is the government could decide to stop people from trading, to stop private individuals from trading with immigrants. Okay, that's not like the market. That's not like somebody who owns a place of business deciding that they don't want to trade with somebody. That's like somebody deciding that they don't want someone else to trade with someone else, right? That is, so the government doesn't have the right to tell private individuals who they can or can't trade with. So the government could decide that they don't want to provide services to the immigrants, right? Or if they have the right to provide services at all in the first place, but right. But they can't decide that private organizations can't do that. Okay, am I assuming anarchism? I didn't really follow why Dan thought that my arguments were assuming anarchism. I think I'm just assuming that there's a general presumption against harmful coercion, which I think you should agree with even if you're not an anarchist. Okay, well, I guess I didn't understand that point enough to say more about it. Okay, lastly, there was a problem about how you could identify the terrorists. Like, well, they're not going to show up at the Immigration and Customs Service with a sign that says terrorist. I don't really know, but I suggest that, we get some people on it to like profile terrorists. Okay. So, so I don't see a problem with racial profiling or national profiling or whatever. I think those are kind of rational. So at a bare minimum, what if we just excluded like young males from countries that have like a high rate of support for terrorism. What if we just do that, and then we don't have to like exclude like old ladies from Europe, right? old British ladies or whatever, right? Which we are currently doing. Not that there's a lot of those, but like there's a whole lot of people who would still not be terror suspects, right? And so I don't understand why we have to exclude all of those just because we're not sure who the terrorists are, right? Okay, all right, that's all.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just coming up on time anyway. So that's perfect. All right. Dan, you have 5 minutes now. So, Mike, thank you for your rebuttal and the jokes that were contained therein. They were very funny. All right. Dan, go ahead.
Oh, I can't hear him.
Thank you. Sorry. So the reason why I think that the cases smuggle in an extreme libertarian anarchist position, which again I'm not saying is wrong, but it limits the persuasive power of it for people who don't accept that view, is that Mike insists on the non-right, the disanalogy. Okay, he insists on a disanalogy between a marketplace excluding people and a people through their government excluding migrants. He just thinks there isn't that sort of what I would call some sort of sovereignty relation. Mike thinks that he has the right to exclude someone from entering his kitchen uninvited. And so he thinks there's a sort of what we could call sovereignty relationship of an owner to his own property. He doesn't seem to think that there could be this sort of sovereignty over a territory for non-property relationships, like a people over their territory. And I think that's something that only a libertarian or anarchist is going to be sympathetic to. Most people think that peoples have a right to control who's within their borders. Most people think that a country can keep some of its nationals from doing certain things on their property or trading with certain people within their borders, at least. Only a libertarian or anarchist is going to have problems with that. So, like, you can't hold a fugitive in your property. You can't like pollute your property in certain ways and stuff like that. So, these things are widely accepted, except in libertarian anarchist circles. And so just because one of our members wants to trade with Marvin doesn't mean that that member has the right to trade with Marvin, unless again, you're sort of an extreme libertarian or anarchist. Leftists in charge. Like there are a lot of Republicans, but the people who control, the people who tend to occupy bureaucracies tend to be on the left and tend to be pro whatever that bureaucracy is for. So like you won't get people occupying a bureaucracy being like, yeah, we're doing a shitty job, just like get rid of this bureaucracy, right? That doesn't happen in education. It doesn't happen in border enforcement, whatever. So, these you create these, and I think Mike is going to be sympathetic to this point, that you just create this huge infrastructure of people who their whole livelihood is based upon migration, and there's a lot of vested interest in keeping migration going. So I think we should not have, and likewise aid, right? I mean, so you're not going to get the bureaucracies that provide social services to be less enthusiastic about providing social services to migrants. Profiling, again, try to get that past leftists. You're not going to get it past leftists. I mean, you could talk about that you would do it, but it's not going to ever happen. They're not going to profile. And then, you point out, okay, well, this guy just came from Algeria to France, and now he's like living in France. So it's like a French national coming in. He's a French national, okay? But we still want to discriminate against him, so now you have to racially profile or religiously profile. Are you really going to do that? No, you're not going to do that. You're not going to get that. You're not going to get those sort of discriminations happening. we once were able to, but in any foreseeable future we're not. Hey, if you could get the left to be cool with it, then we could talk about migration again. But until you do that, we should table the migration talk, or at least the open borders talk. I think that's my time, and we could move on from here.
Yeah, that's your time. Perfect. So in this section, Mike, if you want to ask any questions of Dan, you're going to have a little bit of time to do so. So feel free to just ask questions about any of the written work or anything that's come up during the course of the debate. And we're going to give you a few minutes to do that, 5 minutes specifically. So go ahead.
All right. Well, yeah. Okay. Sorry. I have comments more than questions, really. But and that might be abusing my time. Let's see. I guess I wanted to talk more about this point about, am I assuming anarchism or something? So I guess you, Dan, have the idea that the country acts through the government, so the government gets to count as the country's representative. And so, like, if a marketplace can decide to exclude people, then a country can decide to voluntarily exclude people, and it does that by having the government do that. And then it just seems to me like that that view leads to justifying all sorts of policies that not only libertarians would object to, and just like, it could be okay to like exclude women from voting or exclude people from criticizing the government, etc. Because like a private organization could exclude women who vote from their membership, or could exclude people from criticizing the organization, whatever. So, right. So why doesn't your view lead to totalitarianism being okay?
Do I respond? Yeah. So I don't have like some worked out political theory, but I think the first thing I would say is that it doesn't even have to be representative, just that there could be some sort of right authority, right sort of governmental authority that limits the trade of some of the members of the nation. And does admitting to such a thing mean that you have to accept that, so it's not like some mass democracy, like, oh, okay, well, some tyranny of the majority. I'm not even committing myself to democracy. So you could have a view that there are certain sorts of rights that a government has to do to its people, and certain sort of rights that it doesn't. And then the question is limiting migration one of those rights or not? Is limiting the vote for women or some other, some totalitarian thing, one of those rights or not? And we have to talk about that. It's not the mere fact that the government's constituted and has some sort of rights to limit the trade of its members.
So I was getting the idea that the government gets to limit migration because they represent the country, they represent the society as a whole, and like the society as a whole has the right to do that if they want to, just like how a private organization would have the right. Right, but now, from your answer, it sounds like you didn't really have a theory about why the government would get to do things.
Yeah, I don't have some completely worked out view about like political authority. You have a rather worked out view of political authority that is anarchist, okay? But for those of us who don't buy it, there's work yet to be done about what, and work done by smarter people than me about what political authority would entail, and what the limits of it are. But I don't want to even be committed to democracy. I mean, so for instance, suppose there was some weird thing where, suppose you have a king, and for some reason everyone in the land just got real stupid for 10 years, and and just wanted horrible things. I think it would be okay for that king to just like not obey the will of the people and just force down measures that are good for the people. So when they snap out of it, or something like that. John Stuart Mill thought kind of the same things, about free speech. Talking about a people in their nonage. And so it's I'm not committing myself to necessarily a government having authority only through the being representative of the wishes of the people. But I do think a government is responsible for doing what's good for the people. I will say that much.
Yeah. Well, I mean that. So the scenario in which the government can be undemocratic and still legitimate, that might be like a weird alternate reality scenario. Like, is there any scenario that would actually happen in the real world where a democratic government would be legitimate? Or I wonder.
Where democratic government would be legitimate.
An undemocratic government. I mean, so like I thought you would be committed to democracy or something, because like I thought you were suggesting that the government is the representative of the society, and so the government doing something counts as the society doing it.
Yeah, I don't know if I even use the word representative, but insofar as it is a representative, it could be a representative in the way that a parent or a legal guardian represents the interests of the people under its charge, right? Without necessarily being beholden to doing what the children want it to do.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
I mean,
I was going to go to Dan's questions, if that's okay now. Just for
yeah.
No
I
worries.
didn't really have
Well,
any questions.
we'll cycle back. Yeah. So Dan, if you want to start your line of questioning, feel free
Yeah.
to.
So one of my questions, I think Mike answered already. Do you believe in migrant-citizen sort of symmetry, that if you can't do it to a citizen, you shouldn't be able to do it to migrants? Some Lobots do seem to hold this. I don't know if you do. So let's call that question one. You could discuss any of these questions you want. What we'll call question two is, what's your view about hated migration, mass migrate, or open borders with regard to hated countries? So what would you say about Israel having open borders right now, given the high probability that a lot of people would be motivated to infiltrate Israel and destroy it from within? I'd like to hear what you have to say about that, because one might think that a lot of Western countries, especially America, are in a similar position. Let's call that question two. Question three is a little more in the weeds. Do you believe that barring someone from entering your kitchen is harmful coercion? It seems like maybe you don't, and so you understand harmful coercion in a kind of moralized way. And because then obviously if you think that's not harmful coercion, that's just outweighed by some sort of right you have, then one wonders if the same things can't be said. Question four is, can you talk about your Marvin case as it relates to things like just refugees who are just trying to don't really have anything to trade, aren't coming to trade, or as you say in your 2010 paper, you believe that one has a right to migrate just for a change of society, I think is your words, right? So it's not even about trading or being condemned to living in a third world, just literally a change of society. You just like hanging out with Americans more. How effective is your does your Marvin case really apply to any of that? Does that matter, et cetera? So any of those questions you want to talk about would be great.
So I probably don't have time to answer all of those. The easiest, the fastest question is, should Israel have open borders? I guess I would say no, for like you might say utilitarian reasons or something, and self-defense reasons. So like I think if they let a bunch of Arabs or a bunch of Muslims in, I think they would be literally destroyed, like physically. Although maybe they should be open to Americans coming in or Europeans or whatever. Okay. So let's see. When you're excluding somebody from your kitchen, does that count as harmful coercion? So stopping somebody from getting a benefit that they would get normally counts as harming them, but not if the benefit would come from you. So if you stop somebody from getting your property, that doesn't count as harming them. That counts as refusing to benefit them. And then you might think, oh, okay, so like maybe the United States is going to stop migrants from getting benefit from the United States, so that counts as failing to benefit, not harming them, right? But my claim is, no, the government is stopping the migrants from getting benefits from private individuals, so that counts as the government harming them. Let's see. Is there a symmetry between migrants and citizens? I don't know, because I don't completely know what that means. So everybody has the same basic rights, but they could apply differently in different circumstances. And so the circumstances of migrants might be different from citizens. So there might be a relevant difference. There might be relevant differences because like certain seemingly parallel policies could have different consequences if applied to migrants than if the seemingly parallel policy was applied to citizens, right? So it might be that like the consequence of having a high burden of proof for criminal accusations for citizens are a lot better than the consequences of having a very high burden of proof when you apply to potential migrants. And so that could justify like having a lower requirement for evidence of somebody's criminality, when they're trying to migrate. Okay, and then the last thing was something about there are refugees who don't particularly have anything to trade, and do they have a right to move? And so so I think they have a prima facie right to move. I mean, it's harmful coercion to stop them from moving. Although, by the way, like nobody has the obligation to give them anything if they don't want to. So like, you don't have to give them a place to live. Like they have to find, they have to find their way. They have to, try to find a job or whatever to afford a place to live. Like, I don't think the government is obligated to give them anything.
Could I just 1 second follow up on one of those questions? So with regard to migrant citizen symmetry, so you say something in your 2010 essay. Well, one of the in your prolepsis worrying about how restrictionists are going to respond to like religious shifts. So okay, if Netherlands has open borders, most people there will be Muslim in no time. Do we have a right to limit migration on those grounds? I think you give you quickly say, well, you can't, suppose like a bunch of my neighbors decided to convert to Buddhism. I can't keep them from being Buddhist. So therefore, we can't keep a bunch of people coming in who have a different religion. That sounded to me very citizen migrants, like a citizen migrant symmetry point. And I just wonder if you want to elaborate on that, because maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Yeah. Well, let's say that there's a presumption that you should treat people the same if you don't have any reason to the contrary. But that like prima facie, if you shouldn't restrict person A, then you shouldn't restrict person B in a certain way. But that just means like, well, you've got to give a reason why they're different. So if you want to treat the migrants more restrictively or more harshly than you treat the citizens, then there has to be a good reason for that. But I'm not saying there couldn't be a good reason for it.
Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah. All right. So with that, we're going to transition into the portion where Steve and I are going to ask some questions. And then if anybody else in their intervening time has questions that they would like to ask, the chat is open and we will select from those questions the ones that we would like to ask to either debater. So if you want to ask a question for Dan, indicate that in the question. If you want to ask a question for Mike, indicate that in the question so we know who to direct it to. So with that, yes, Steve, if you want to ask your questions, feel free to go ahead and do so.
So I'm really enjoying the debate. So thank you guys. I'm very much appreciating it. Michael, I'll start with you. My question is whether or not you think there is collective property. So for example, imagine you had a migrant walk into this country and he brought a wheelbarrow into Fort Knox. Leaving aside, it's normally locked up, but assume it's not. And he starts loading it up with gold bricks and he sort of walks out with it. And you might think, hey, what are you doing? And the migrant says, well, look, I don't believe in collective property, so it's unowned, hence I can take it. You might think, well, no, it's collectively owned. I mean, it's owned by the citizenry. Same thing if the migrant wanted to build a house in the middle of Yellowstone, or if he wanted to set up some sort of uh, food truck in the middle of Route 90, highway number 90. You might think, look, we have collective property. Given that there is collective property, if you think that's plausible, whether it be justified from the get-go would be a separate issue. But if you think there is collective property, even if we're in the land of the second best, isn't that a good reason to say, look, starving Marvin or some economic immigrant is trespassing on collective property? In the same way, the individual would not be permitted to take bars of gold from Fort Knox. He would also not be allowed to use our roads or highways, to take our welfare benefits, or to set up a house in the middle of Yellowstone. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, when you told that story about the migrant going to Fort Knox, I assume he'd be treated the same as a native-born citizen going into Fort Knox and taking the gold. And so, okay, so like they shouldn't be allowed to do that. Does that mean that they shouldn't be allowed to drive on the roads? Well, I don't know. Like I haven't seen why they should be treated differently from the citizen, right? So the citizen would be arrested for trying to take the gold from Fort Knox, but they wouldn't be arrested for trying to walk on the street. So,
but my question is whether or not there's collective property. For example, for the same reason, I mean, independent of whether or not someone would get arrested, the question is, why would they get arrested? If they would get arrested, and if you think they should get arrested, precisely because there is collective property, then it would seem to apply to highways. In the same way, look, even if you have no good reason to keep migrants out of your kitchen, you're still free to do so in virtue of the property rights you have of your kitchen. Why wouldn't that apply with regard to the collective property that citizens have in the United States?
Philosophical question: is there collective property? Well, there's some collective property. Like you can have a timeshare in a condo, and then like a group of people, or you could own stock in a company, and like the shareholders collectively own the company. Okay, so there's collective property. What about stuff that's bought by the government? Is that property of, I don't know, property of the government or property of the people in general? I think it's sort of like property, but sort of not, right? Because like it wasn't really legitimately acquired, because it was really acquired by stealing. Yeah, okay, but also we don't want to say that it's just like stuff out in the state of nature, right? So, like we're in the land of the second best, where you can't get people to follow all the rules. So like, what is the second best rules that you could have? Well, they probably involve that, the government can stop people from stealing the stuff and damaging the stuff, but there should be more restrictions on what the government can do with the quote its stuff, right? Because it's not really its stuff. And as I sort of said to Dan, like, well, if you treat it as if the government just totally owned this stuff like normal, then you can justify totalitarianism, right? Because like, okay, like I could say no women who vote are allowed in my kitchen. So then the government, like if you treat the government as owning all of the collective property and having the right to decide the conditions for using it, then they can say no women who vote are allowed to use the roads or any public property, which basically means that they have to not live, or they have to not live in the country. Right? Okay, so like, this is supposed to get your intuition that there should be sort of like moral restrictions on the government's use of public property beyond those that would apply to ordinary property.
But just one quick follow-up. Still, the wrong maker, the reason that you can't take the gold is that it is collective property. Again, it may be unfortunate there is collective property, but that's what we have. And if so, why wouldn't that apply to the roads? Why wouldn't, let's just make up a figure. Let's say that the average migrant, and I'm making this figure, in New York State gets, let's say, $50,000 worth of benefits per year. And you think, okay, well, it's really unfortunate that we have a welfare system. Okay, but given that we have one, and given that the resources are collective property, why wouldn't we say, look, in the land of the second best, given that the collective property does the explanatory work, that's a good reason even if you oppose collective property altogether. And that explains why you can't take the bricks of gold from Fort Knox. It also explains why you cannot come into New York if, upon entering New York, you're promptly going to be cut a check for $50,000.
Not exactly. That's not exactly property, but it's not exactly just stuff in the state of nature, right? It's an intermediate state, right? So because we wouldn't want to say the rule is it's just like like the quote collective property. We wouldn't want to say it's just like finding a tree out in the woods that in a completely unsettled area. But we also wouldn't want to say that it's just like you owning your own kitchen. We want to say it's something in between those, right? So it's only sort of.
I mean, all right, well, we'll have to respectfully disagree on that. With regard to the right against harmful coercion, I'm wondering if there really is such a right as opposed to property rights. For example, you might think that there is a right to use violent self-defense against an attacker, or you might think there's a right to punish someone who's a wrongdoer, and you don't have to compensate the person for doing so, nor do you have to apologize, which suggests there's no residue duty. If you infringe on the prima facie right. And in fact, you might think harm is beside the point. I mean, you might think that you can use defensive violence even if someone is not harming you at all, they're benefiting you by using paternalistic coercion. So I guess my first question is, why think that there's a right against harmful coercion as opposed to a property right? Again, if there were even a prima facie right, then when you used it in just self-defense, then you would owe an apology or compensation, but it seems that you don't. Why not assume the property rights rather than right against harmful coercion?
Well, okay, so like why you don't have to apologize for using self-defense is roughly that the person lost their right or got suspended when they pose a threat to other people, right? Now, could we treat it as? What if you say they're just property rights? Well, why wouldn't the same thing apply? Like, okay, so you harm somebody in self-defense, and then what if they didn't have a right against harmful coercion, but they had a property right? So, okay, well, why don't you have to apologize to them for violating their property right? Right? Because like whatever, you damage their body and their body is their property, right? Or if you have to damage their car because they're about to run over you, so then you damage their property. So they, why don't you have to apologize to them for damaging their property? No, well, it's just that it's their fault. It's their fault.
So, but the problem here is that, look, I've given you cases of, in fact, harmful coercion to which you don't have a right against it, not even a prima facie right. In the case of valid self-defense, if you said, look, there's forfeiture, but the forfeiture would kick in here only if we have a justicized account of coercion. That is, only if harmful coercion involves unjust coercion. But once you do that, we've just begged the question, because then we have to know, when is the coercion just or unjust? Whereas property rights gives us a clean and powerful account of when you're infringing on someone's right. When you're touching someone's body or property without their permission, then you may not do so. And if you continue to do so, you're going to owe compensation or an apology, or they're permitted to use defensive violence. But harmful coercion seems to be misleading, and that's why once we move to property rights, you can see that that's where the collective property becomes extremely important, precisely because what matters is whether or not these migrants are infringing on either collective property rights, or, as you would put it, quasi-collective property rights.
Well, okay, wait. So, I did want to address the thing you said earlier about paternalistic coercion. Like, you would have a right of self-defense against paternalistic coercion. Maybe, but having a right against harmful coercion doesn't exclude also having a right against paternalistic coercion. Right? I just didn't want to take a stand on paternalistic coercion.
But look, there seems to be a unified explanation as to why you have a right against harmful coercion and against non-harmful coercion, namely that the coercion is trespassing on your rights. So while it doesn't exclude other rights, there seems to be a cleaner, unified account in terms of property rights.
Oh, yeah, I don't see a big difference here, but between what we're saying. Um, when you violate, okay, so the property rights, I take it, would include your own body, right? Like you would say you have a property right in your own body, right? Um, then, okay, so like when you're violating somebody's property rights, and then you said, well, when you're touching their property without their consent, but I don't think that's right. So like you can certainly violate somebody's property rights without actually touching them or their property. So, or like directly. Okay, so you can set off a chain reaction that affects the person or their property, but you don't actually touch them. Okay, so all right, so like what kinds of chain reactions would not be allowed? Well, you could say, well, you're not allowed to like produce any effect on their property. Well, okay, then that excludes every action whatsoever. Or you could say, well, you're not allowed to produce a harmful effect on their property, right? Or like you're not allowed to significantly change it or something like that. So, I mean, um,
All right. And then just Nathan, if I'm allowed one more question. So I just want to kind of a general approach. You seem to say that Israel could exclude migrants on the basis of self-defense. And this example I'm taking from Rishi Joshi. Imagine that Ireland has 5 million people and Pakistani has over 200 million people. And imagine that 20 million people from Pakistan want to come to Ireland. Would it be okay for the Irish people or the Irish government to say, look, we don't, and Dan used an example of this, just because some generous Irish individuals want to let in 20 million Pakistanis, is there any sense that they can say, well, this may not be a safety consideration, but it's consideration about, flooding our resources, clogging up our roads, changing our property in a way such that we have a right that's analogous to that of Israel.
oh, so the Pakistanis they're just going to use government services. That's the only thing they're doing.
Well, there's 20 million of them. I mean, it's 5 million right now in the country. So, I mean, the road's going to get clogged up. Sure. I mean, they might try and impose Sharia law. They might also change the liberal bases, for example, the tradition of free speech that at least Ireland used to have. So, yeah, I mean, you might think that, yeah.
Yeah, so some of those things I think of as more serious threats than others, right? So like, if you think that they're going to actually impose Sharia law, like that would be a major rights violation. So you
But then just one quick follow-up that with Dan, if you think that in the United States, 50 million immigrants, for example, 15% of the population, would vastly destroy economic liberty or lessen it to a significant degree, why isn't that analogous to imposing Sharia law of sorts, just to a lesser degree? If you have 50 million immigrants, let's say 15% of the US population, and they want to vastly reduce our civil liberties in addition to our economic liberties, why isn't that an excellent reason to restrict them on the basis of exactly the same defensive reasoning that you permitted in the case of Ireland and Israel? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
well, do immigrants want to destroy our civil liberties? Like I don't think this is generally true. So I think there might be particular classes of immigrants that you'd have reason to think, you know. So like maybe we should just restrict the ones from the countries that we think are highest risk.
But that's going to be, isn't that going to be all the countries that have the starving Marvins? I mean, isn't the case that the poor countries are precisely, in general, with many exceptions, the ones that don't have the great interest in economic liberty? Aren't they also the ones that seem to indicate through polling results that they want to severely restrict the freedom of speech? Haven't we seen that the people supporting various other incursions into our civil liberties, for example, the decimation of the Fourth Amendment? Couldn't we say that, look, the threat is great when we introduce people with less emphasis or priority on liberty, both economic and political?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if that's true or if the reverse is true, right? 'Cause I've met some immigrants And most of the immigrants that I've met are more pro-American, kind of a lot, kind of a lot more pro-American and pro-freedom than most of the native-born Americans that I meet. So, okay, but
Just one quick follow-up. Is that true with regard to voting for economic liberty? I mean, if we do polling results, given that you and I have very similar tastes with regard to economic liberty, do you really want to say that the vast majority of the 50 million immigrants support the sort of economic liberty programs that you and I support?
well, so first, I don't think there's 50 million, right? But anyway, like,
You don't think it's 50 million in the country today? 15% of the population?
wait, what?
You don't think there's 50 million immigrants in the country today? 15% of the population?
I I don't know how many there are. Is it, do we have data on that? But okay, most of them would not be libertarians, and most of the native-born Americans wouldn't be libertarians either. Um, but okay, but um, maybe they would be less libertarian. It just sort of like depends on how much less they are, right? Like, okay, there's a bunch of Democrats who are voting for bad policies. Would we be justified in, like, if you could, like, you know, kick one of them out of the country because they're voting Democrat? Would that be justified? And I don't rule out that it could be justified, like, but it doesn't seem like it's justified in likely circumstances. And then so like if you're worried about an immigrant who's just going to vote Democrat, then okay, well it doesn't seem like you're justified in forcing them to live in poverty and oppression for the rest of their life just because of that.
Nathan, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. All right, perfect. So that interchange was electric and interesting and dynamic, and at times very humorous. So I appreciate that. So Dan, okay, perfect. I have a few questions that I prepared before the debate, and I had some since. So I would like to ask you those now. So just starting right off the top, I was wondering if I could ask you a question about the duty to save, which seems to be a central issue in this debate. So I think that what I want to ask is the following. Is there a duty to save? And may a person refuse to help a drowning man onto his yacht, for instance? And so by analogy, shouldn't we let Starvin Marvin, in Mike's case, into the country, by analogy, his yacht? So is there a duty to save, and how does that duty to save interact with the issue of immigration and open borders, is I suppose the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there is some limited duty of beneficence to save. You should save sometimes at limited cost to yourself, strangers, but that's pretty limited. Now, there's been a very good essay, I think one of the best essays in response to Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality is an essay by Sterry and Moen, where they argue that really to avoid some bad consequences from Singer type reasoning, we should understand much of the duty of rescue in terms of an informal sort of insurance policy. So we expect people to help other people in circumstances when there is no one else can help and it's an emergency situation, et cetera, kind of like, but various safeguards with, and various sorts of our intuitions are best explained by understanding them in terms of like safeguards against moral hazard and exploitation, stuff like that. So I like that view a lot. But one consequence Sterry and Moen don't draw out is that that also kind of means if someone is probably not party to your sort of insurance, your sort of formal insurance model, then you don't have that obligation to save them either. So like, if I have a good feeling like, Marvin would not accept me into his country if I needed to be a refugee in his country, then that says something about my obligation to bring Marvin into our country as a refugee. And I think that one of the absurdist things that's going on now with mass migration is that that you have some of the highest trust societies bring in people from low trust societies, and the needle, there's debate about how much that needle moves over generations. Do low trust people become more high trust over time? And you'll hear different stories. But if you bring a lot of low trust people in, they seem to stay relatively low trust, and especially and then if you bring a lot of low trust groups in and you have a lot more diversity, it tends to decrease the trust. And even Kaplan admits this. It tends to decrease the trust of the high trust receiving countries. Okay, and so as that trust diminishes, then you can expect less and less of this informal insurance model type justification to be at play. So we would just have a whole bunch of people just letting other people drown in shallow ponds, which is what you see in low trust societies all the time.
All right, perfect. So if I could respond to your position, there are just a few points that I would like to raise in turn. So the first is you mentioned, for instance, that we have duties to rescue in limited cost to yourself situations. Would that be an accurate characterization of what you said?
Yeah, I mean, if you, I know a duty of beneficence to do that. Now, if there is this under this insurance model, there's difference. I may have a duty to save even at high cost, but part of that informal insurance model means that I will be reciprocated after the emergency's over. So, for instance, like if I'm like neurotic about sinking ships and I outfitted a lifeboat with a bunch of food, and the Titanic goes down, it's just you and me in the lifeboat. All right. And I'm not sure I have enough food to last us till we get whatever. I think I have a duty to share that food with you. Okay. And not just of beneficence, but I think of this insurance model, right? But I would expect that, okay, when we land to shore or something like that, there be some sort of gratitude or something like that. So likewise, if I'm pulling a kid out of a drowning in a shallow pond, and it costs me for some reason a lot of money to do so, then most normal people would say, okay, now there has to be some sort of GoFundMe for Dan after the event, to sort of recompense Dan for doing that. That's Sterry and Mullen's own view. And I don't see anything like that happening on the vast scale of refugeeism, especially given how leftists have blown up this idea of refugees to everyone's a refugee who comes from any sort of country with high crime, which oftentimes they have less violent crime than America. So it's a meaningless term at this point.
Right. Yeah. So Okay. Sorry. So that all right. Okay. Perfect. So yeah, I guess then I'll just sort of rattle off my questions then. So the first one is to say this. So it seems like what your position is, at least in part, from what you said, is that, look, if it's a significantly low cost to you, right, like you're not going to have a GoFundMe. People aren't going to have to sort of like, one prayer for the person who actually went ahead and saved the individual. Then yeah, you have some duty upon yourself, given that A, it's very low cost, B, you have a lot of resources, and C, it's not going to like inconvenience you significantly or something like that, right? Or we can modify that, we can put some icing on it or some lipstick on it, but like that seems to be essentially the position. Now, it seems like from economic research from people like Kaplan, they're going to say something like, not only is it not the case that that's true, right? It's actually going to benefit you, right? If you bring in a lot of these migrant workers, then it's actually going to benefit the country. So I guess the question is something like this. This is the first question, so I'll just read the question is, are you just saying that all that economic research is wrong? Which seems like it's incumbent on your position to say. Then the second is you say something like, okay, well, we have this informal insurance policy, right? Only if they're in immediate sort of situations in which things are quite demanding and we have to go and rescue them. Well, it seems like if there's any indication from normative ethics, there is a demandingness problem with respect to ethics. You get this on utilitarian views, you get this on deontological views, right? People are in exigent circumstances and in straitened conditions all across the world, and this produces a demandingness objection. And that seems to be prima facie evidence that there are people in these types of situations and that we have a commensurate duty to rescue them, at least if we can, and it's not high cost, and the economic data would seem to dispense with the idea that it isn't high cost and that it can in fact benefit us. So that's the second thing. But just so I could rattle off my questions, because you know, the other question that I like really wanted to ask was this. So when we have these like rights to association type question, right? So it seems like, well, do I have a right to associate, for instance, with, let's say, a Haitian that I want to employ? And the government says, I don't want to associate, let's say, with that Haitian because I want to close the borders and whatnot. I think that there's a standoff here, right? A little bit of like a Western standoff. And I suppose that this is the question. So given the following conflict of rights, who should prevail? The government's right not to associate with foreigners, or let's say Jones's right to associate with foreigners in his home country? So who wins in that right standoff? So I guess those are my questions. I have more bullets in the barrel, but I suppose I'll let you.
Just to go very quickly. Yeah, I think governments do have a moral right to limit who their citizens deal with in certain ways within the country. So I think the government wins that standoff, depending on the type of relationship. And trade is one of them. So I'm not. I'm relatively pro-capitalist person with limits, and for as a nationalist, those limits are those that serve the national interest. So I think the government does have a right to limit, consensual acts of capitalism between consenting adults when it's not in the national when it's not in the national interest. Now, it may be in the national interest. It may ding the national interest, if it's rare. Okay, but if we're talking about some huge scale, then I think we need to step in. With regard to do migrants help us economically? Well, I don't like it's not the case that when I said costs, it's not like, well, the only costs are going to be economic. There are other costs. But so those costs are more than sufficient for me to, in my opinion, for us to justify very strict restrictions at this point. But I mean, cultural costs and costs to our native children with respect to access to their institutions and so forth, but and control of their institutions and so forth. But do I think immigrants help us economically? Yeah, a lot of that research was done under much more limited migration from certain limited areas, not the sort of gates opened types of migration that we're seeing today. What we're seeing today is more and more research showing that they are that sort of quasi open borders policy actually is quite harmful to the economies. Again, GDP may raise, but like individually, people become poor, and so okay, yeah, it's going. It certainly hurt. Even Kaplan says, okay, yes, Kaplan working with that old data, usually with just America, by the way. Yeah, it hurts. It hurts the least skilled Americans. But we could just give them money. I think that's bad for the least skilled Americans. I think we definitely have obligations to our least skilled Americans over migrants. But I'm not in favor of just limiting it to high skilled migration either. I don't like bringing a bunch of high skilled migrants either. I think that I don't understand why we would subject our own native children to this realm of vicious competition within their own homelands. Which would happen if you bring in the elite from around the world. America is not a coliseum of high IQ, high talented people to duke it out in. It is a homeland, okay? And so it is a place of refuge for our own children, not the world's talented elite.
If I could come in really quickly, specifically, I think on this point. So if America, and this will be the last question before the closing statements, although there are plenty of other things I'd like to ask. If America is sort of our homeland and we can make rules pursuant to our own predilections and desires and penchants, why not then carry this case over to the individual business owner as well? So let's say, suppose we have a bakery and that bakery says whites only on the outside, for it or against it?
Yeah, libertarians have to be for that being morally okay. So whatever. I I'm not arguing, by the way, some sort of freedom of association view that just um, freedom of association trumps all, which would justify whites only or blacks only or whatever policies. But so I don't know if that's.
I guess the thing is that, I mean, imagine they were to employ the exact same reasoning that you were just to employ. So, for instance, they say, look, this barbershop is for my community only. I typically identify my community as white-skinned, and it's not a coliseum that's going to cut the hair of any individual or any Tom, Dick, and Harry that's going to walk in. It says it on the outside, and if you object, you can go somewhere else. I guess, according to your line of reasoning, it seems like this is a completely symmetrical argument with respect to the barbershop. So if there is a moral problem with one position but not the other, I'm wondering what the symmetry breaker is.
Yeah, I guess I mean, well, first of all, I mean, I don't hold that country that homelands are. This is one of my quibbles, perhaps with Mike, that I don't see homelands as best understood as marketplaces or that fruitfully analogized to marketplaces, and nor do really I view them as analogous to clubs. It's just sui generis, and just sort of sui generis thing. Maybe, I guess, as a nativist, I would say it's most analogous to a family, and and so I think that. I think it's morally bad to say, my kids are just sort of meh IQ wise. I could really have smarter kids if I just adopt more kids. And, I guess you have smarter kids, and so forth. And if you're proud as punch of your, these smart kids you adopted from around the world, winning the spelling bee or whatever, you know, uh, you will get that until maybe all the kids hate each other and hate you in the long run, which would happen, of course. But you definitely have betrayed the kids you have. You've betrayed your own children, and so I just don't understand why anyone would do that. But I have plenty of friends who see nothing wrong with it, and they're just like, yeah, we're better, and we're richer, and maybe our sports teams win and so forth. But there's no connection between the people in that sports team, or no connection between the people and their captains of industry, and no connection between the people and their the elite professors and so forth. And so it's it's a betrayal on my view.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, so at this part, Mike, if you want to just give some concluding remarks, you're more than welcome to do so. Oh, there you are. You're a little bit off screen. I was wondering if you floated away or something.
Just saying that, in one of the big errors and fallacies that leftists have, and even just whatever mainstream Republicans have, is thinking that in a capitalist economy, other people doing well hurts you, and that's the opposite of the truth. So if we bring in people who bring in smart people who start up companies or whatever, that doesn't hurt us, that helps us. Right, so it's like if if you're bringing other kids into your family, it's like if bringing in the other kids actually helped your kids more, then you should do it, right? And okay, yeah, no, you shouldn't trade your kids away, and you shouldn't send your own citizens away either, right? Or, yeah, but if the cost of helping your kids is that you also help somebody else's kids, then yeah, go for it. Yeah, anyway, okay. Anyway, I don't really have more to say other than repeating what I already said. So, actually, I guess I think, a major difference between me and Dan is that, I guess Dan is ascribing kind of intrinsic moral significance to the nation. Right. So, I think you have obligations to your family, to your children that you produced, but I don't think that you have similar obligations to your just like people who were born in the same country as you. But like as I say, even if you do, I think that doesn't mean that you should restrict immigration, right? But like I think that I was expecting Dan's response to Nathan to be, well, like race is an arbitrary grouping, but the nation isn't an arbitrary grouping, right? But then no, I don't know why one of them is more arbitrary than the other. So like maybe I could invite Dan to comment on that.
Yeah. Um, as far as closing comments, I think we are touching now on the real heart of it. What is it? What does it mean to be a nation? And can a nation survive under mass migration? And do we have special obligations to those in our nation? And so, to that, I would say no nations cannot survive mass migration of the scale we're talking about. Um, I think it is essential that we have nations because it's a cruel world full of competition. The vast majority of political philosophy is useless because um, it does not factor in competition. And so it's a ruthlessly vicious world out there, and it's sort of way that conservatives tend to look at the world. Like we have a high threat. I forget what the psychologists call it, but we're threat sensitive. So my experience traveling the world is it's a cruel world out there, and you need to be part of a group. You need to have a group of people who have your back, and you need to have their back, or you're going to get picked apart. And so everywhere we go, we see that groups who have a high sense of asabaya and solidarity are having more children and migrating out and taking over literal land, and those who don't are losing control and sovereignty of their spaces and are getting edged out, and then inevitably becoming more and more um, reactionary in their politics. And we're going to see some horrific times coming up that I would like to avoid by being prudent now. It maybe is already too late, but by being prudent now and keeping this sort of thing from happening. If mass migration really helped groups in the long term, it would be a very common strategy around the world. But it's a strategy you don't see anywhere. Okay, so you do see instances where there was, mass inflows of people, but it's in terms of conquest. All right, so why wouldn't this strategy have been widely adopted by our ancestors if it were so successful? But it wasn't. Okay, so and again, we're seeing, it's not like we're seeing that anyone who dipped their toes in open borders are like, this is great, we need to speed this up. No, it's like all we see is movements against it. All we see is nations like Sweden that experimented with it pulling back. Okay, so you don't like, why would that be happening? Why can nations like Turkey literally like extort European countries to give them aid to keep migrants out if they really felt in their heart of hearts that it was beneficial for their societies? Okay, so I think it's just Mike is a empirical minded dude. He is a common sense philosopher. He's committed to those types of things, and I think that applying those sorts of principles of just being empirical about, is it working? Why hasn't it happened? What has happened given the experiments that we've had? He should be a lot more cautious about his open borders philosophy.
All right, perfect. Yeah, so that kind of rounds everything off and concludes things. So yeah, thank you very much, Dan and Mike. I was really happy that I could get you both here, specifically because you're both just experts in this topic, and your written work is fantastic and also very good to read. You both are great prose writers. So yeah, thank you for joining us. And yeah, wait, I'll stop recording at this point. But yeah.